The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the lakeside diner. Senior Chief Marcus Reed stood beside his booth with his eggs going cold on the plate behind him, one wrist already locked. Officer Derek Holland's hand clamped tight around his forearm. Grace Miller froze behind the counter, coffee pot still in her hand. A few regulars near the window turned in their seats. At a corner table, a retired Navy chief named Walter Hayes had already lifted his phone, thumb finding the record button without needing to look. "You're being detained," Derek said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Stolen valor, fraud, obstruction, disorderly conduct." "I haven't taken a discount," Marcus said, voice level. "No money, no property, no benefit of any kind. Ask her." He nodded toward Grace. "I paid full price." "You're wearing an insignia you didn't earn," Derek said again, quieter now, as if repeating it might make it more true than it had been the first time. "You don't know that," Marcus said. "You don't have anything that tells you that." Derek tightened the second cuff, hard enough that Marcus felt the metal bite. In Derek's mind, this was the moment his online group had been building toward for 2 years. Proof, live, in front of witnesses, that he could spot a fraud everyone else had missed. Somewhere on his phone, a private chat was already lighting up with messages he hadn't answered yet. Other members of his group, waiting to hear how the confrontation had gone, ready to celebrate before a single fact had been checked. He didn't know yet that within the hour, a call from a Navy command duty office would reach his own chief's desk, and that the call wouldn't be the thing that ended his career. The evidence already sitting in that diner would do that on its own. 20 minutes earlier, the morning had been quiet enough to hear the grill hiss. Quiet enough that Marcus had almost let himself relax for the first time in days. Riverside, Virginia sat under a cold October sky, the kind of morning where breath fogged for a second and then vanished. Inside the lakeside diner, the smell of burnt coffee and butter on the flat top filled the room, mixing with low conversation and a muted television running the morning news above the counter. The booths were old vinyl, cracked at the seams, patched with silver tape that had gone yellow at the edges. A bell over the door announced each new customer with the same tired jingle it had used for 20 years. Marcus took a rear booth, the one that let him see the door, without needing to think about why that mattered anymore. He ordered eggs, toast, and coffee, and when Grace came by to refill his cup, she noticed the heavy bracelet on his wrist, engraved letters catching the light. "Somebody special?" she asked, nodding at it. "Someone I served with," Marcus said. "We lost him a few weeks back. Today's part of remembering him." He didn't say more than that, and Grace didn't push. On his fleece, small and subdued, sat a Naval Special Warfare insignia, the kind you'd miss unless you were looking for it, a gift from Aaron Cole's widow after the memorial. Marcus hadn't announced anything about his service to anyone in the diner. He paid full price for his breakfast and left an ordinary tip, the way he did everywhere he went. Derek came in a few minutes later for coffee, the kind of regular who treated the diner like an extension of his patrol route, nodding at Grace like the place belonged to him a little. His eyes moved across the room out of habit, and then stopped on the small insignia on Marcus's fleece. Derek had tried military basic training once. Years before he'd become a police officer, and hadn't made it past the first phase. What he'd built since then was a different kind of identity. Tactical gear on his days off, a growing online group dedicated to exposing what its members called stolen valor, and a private conviction that he could spot a fake through appearance and instinct alone. He believed real operators looked a certain way, carried themselves a certain way, and Marcus, quiet and unassuming in worn jeans and hiking boots, didn't match the picture in Derek's head. He walked over to the booth. "That a Special Warfare pin?" Derek asked, nodding at the fleece. "It is," Marcus said. "You a SEAL?" "I serve in Naval Special Warfare," Marcus said, giving him nothing more than that. "Where'd you train?" "Coronado," Marcus said. One answer, nothing else. Derek's questions came faster after that. Training class numbers, instructor names, boat crew designations, deployment slang most people outside the community would never think to ask about. He asked about a training evolution by a nickname only insiders used. Then about a commanding officer's name from a class number he'd clearly looked up somewhere online, watching Marcus's face for any flicker of hesitation. Marcus recognized what was happening within the first two questions. Derek wasn't asking to learn anything. He was hunting for a wrong answer he could hold up as proof. The way a man circles a story looking for the one loose thread that lets him unravel the whole thing. "I'm not doing this," Marcus said. "I'm on leave. I'm having breakfast. I'm not taking a quiz to justify sitting in a diner." Derek's jaw tightened, like the refusal itself was the confession he'd been waiting for. "There's a federal law against stolen valor," Derek said. "There is," Marcus said. "It applies to false claims tied to obtaining money, property, or some other benefit. Wearing a pin isn't that. Making a general statement about service isn't that either, not on its own." "Did you get a discount here?" Grace answered before Marcus could. "He paid full price. I rang it up myself." She held up the receipt from behind the counter like it settled something, which, legally it did. Derek didn't look at it. "I need to see military ID." "What crime do you think I've committed?" Marcus asked. "Tell me specifically. The insignia." "Your refusal to answer. That's enough for me to be suspicious." "I'll give you my driver's license," Marcus said. And before reaching for his wallet, he said it out loud first. "I'm reaching for my back pocket now." The way a man says it when he already knows how these moments can go wrong. He set a valid Virginia license on the table. Derek picked it up, studied it, and set it back down without any real change in his expression. "I still need military credentials. Am I being detained?" Marcus asked. Derek didn't answer that directly. "Then I'd like to speak to a supervisor," Marcus said. From the corner table, Walter spoke up, calm and even. "Nobody called this in, son. There's no complaint here, no crime reported." "Stay out of it," Derek snapped, and the sharpness in his own voice seemed to surprise him, like he'd heard how it landed only after it left his mouth. The diner had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone's pretending not to listen while listening closely. Derek felt the attention pressing on him now, and something in his face shifted toward embarrassment, then toward the kind of anger that embarrassment turns into when a man doesn't know how to back down gracefully. "You're creating a disturbance," Derek said. "You're the only one raising your voice," Marcus said. "You're detained," Derek said. "Stand up." "I'll comply," Marcus said and began to rise. Before he was fully on his feet, Derek grabbed his arm and spun him toward the table, cups rattling, a fork clattering to the floor. Grace called out for him to stop. Walter's phone stayed up, recording. Marcus put his hands behind his back without being told twice, and the cuffs closed tight enough to leave a mark that would still be visible hours later. "Call a watch commander before you move me," Marcus said. "This arrest has no lawful basis, and it needs to be documented from the start." Derek didn't answer. He walked Marcus through the diner, past every table, out into the cold, and put him in the back of the cruiser. On the drive to the station, Derek talked more than Marcus did. "Federal government doesn't play around with this," he said, glancing at the rearview mirror. "You're about to be an example." Marcus said nothing. He watched the town move past the window, the hardware store, the church with its faded sign, the gas station with one pump out of order, a school crossing guard already at her corner, though the buses wouldn't run for another hour, and use the silence to run through everything that mattered. The exact questions Derek had asked, the names of the witnesses, the location of Walter's phone, what had been taken from him and what hadn't, the exact words Derek had used for the charges. Derek found the silence harder to sit with than any argument would have been. At the station, Sergeant Thomas Bell looked up from the booking desk with the particular weariness of a man who'd processed enough bad arrests to recognize one walking through the door. "What are we charging him with?" Bell asked. "Military impersonation, fraud, obstruction, disorderly conduct." "Who reported the fraud?" "He was uncooperative," Derek said. "Wouldn't provide military ID." "That's not what I asked. Who reported it? What benefit did he get? What false ID did he present?" "He had a valid state license," Marcus said. "I was eating breakfast. Bell looked at Derek for a long moment. None of what you just told me adds up to a crime on its own. He set the charging paperwork aside, unsigned. I'm not finalizing this until I've actually reviewed it. An officer began inventorying Marcus's belongings: wallet, keys, the heavy memorial bracelet, and a government-issued phone that Derek picked up and thumbed awake without asking. A secure lock screen appeared, federal markings visible along the top edge. "Put that down," Bell said, sharp enough that Derek actually flinched. "That's not yours to touch." The phone went into an evidence bag, sealed. Derek pulled up an unofficial public veterans lookup website on the booking room computer and typed in Marcus's name. No result came back. "See," Derek said, like the empty search box was a verdict. "Nothing. Those sites are incomplete," Bell said. "They're not an official verification system, you know that." "It proves nothing," Marcus said, "except that you searched the wrong place." Derek walked him to a holding room without another word, the fluorescent light overhead humming faintly, the kind of sound a person only notices once every other distraction has been stripped away. "I want my phone call," Marcus said. Bell nodded and pointed him to the line himself. Marcus dialed a Navy command duty number from memory, gave his information through the proper verification steps, and within a minute was speaking with Captain Jonathan Price. "I'm detained at the Riverside Police Department," Marcus said. "Stolen valor allegation. They've seized my government phone and sealed it in evidence. I haven't discussed anything operational." "Stay cooperative," Price told him. "Ask for counsel if you need to. Don't discuss assignments with anyone there." Then, to the people around him in his own office, already moving, "Get legal support on this. Confirm his status. Get the Navy liaison and DoD contact looped in now." Marcus didn't speak to anyone above Price that day. No admiral picked up a phone for him personally. What happened instead was slower, and more ordinary, and far more effective. A verification chain built for exactly this kind of situation, moving the way it was designed to move. 9 minutes later, a priority call reached the Riverside Police Department, cutting through the ordinary morning traffic of parking complaints and a fender bender 2 blocks over. Commander Elizabeth Warren, a Navy legal liaison, spoke first with Bell, then with Chief Martin Caldwell once he was pulled in. "Marcus Reed is an active duty senior chief petty officer," she said, calm and precise. "His service is verified. He's currently on authorized leave. The phone your department seized is United States government property and needs to remain sealed until it's formally released or transferred through proper channels. I'd also ask that every record connected to this arrest be preserved. Reports, footage, database queries, all of it." "Do you have evidence of an independent state crime?" she asked. Bell answered honestly. "It's under review." "Then I'd note that the appropriate offices are being made aware of a potential civil rights concern here," Warren said, without raising her voice, without threatening anyone. She didn't need to. The measured certainty in how she said it did more than a warning could have. Chief Caldwell hung up and sat with it for a moment before pulling the file himself. He read through Derek's account. He looked at the valid license. He looked at the thin, contradictory charges. He noted that no complainant existed anywhere in the paperwork. He confirmed, with grace, by phone, that no discount had been given. He looked at the unofficial database search Derek had treated as conclusive. "Release him," Caldwell said. "Unless there's an independent lawful charge, he walks now." He turned to Derek next. "Badge, weapon, radio, access card. Your computer and phone access are suspended, effective immediately." "His record didn't come up online," Derek said, still trying to hold the shape of his case together. "That's not nothing." "A blank search box isn't probable cause," Caldwell said. "It never was." He told Derek not to touch, alter, or add to a single report or piece of evidence connected to that morning. Marcus's belongings were returned to him through a documented chain of custody, item by item, his signature required for each one. Wallet, keys, the bracelet last, the sergeant handling it with a care that felt almost like an apology of its own. The government phone stayed sealed, waiting on proper release. Caldwell apologized to him directly, plainly, without excuses folded into it. "I don't want this quietly filed away," Marcus said. "I want the record corrected. I want the footage and the audit trail preserved. I want the diner video pulled and every database query he made that morning documented. Not just this morning, however far back it needs to go." Derek tried to explain himself once more. Something about instinct, about protecting the meaning of the uniform. Authority doesn't become lawful just because the person you used it on happens to be able to prove you wrong, Marcus said. "Look into what he's done to people who didn't have a command that could make a call like the one I just made." Chief Caldwell requested an outside investigation before the day was over. Special Agent Daniel Cross took the case, and the evidence, once assembled, told a version of the morning that matched almost nothing in Derek's written report. The body camera showed Derek approaching first, uninvited. It showed Marcus eating quietly before that, unbothered, cutting into his eggs like a man with nowhere else he needed to be. It showed Grace confirming full payment. It showed the valid license set plainly on the table, and Derek never once naming an actual reported crime. It showed Marcus asking calmly for a supervisor. It showed Derek escalating alone, and it caught, clear enough to matter, Derek muttering that Marcus didn't look like his idea of a SEAL. The diner's own surveillance system showed the same sequence from a second angle. Walter's phone recording caught Marcus's even tone against Derek's rising voice, second by second, impossible to misread. Derek's written report told a different story entirely, that diner employees had reported Marcus, that Marcus had sought a discount, refused identification, shouted, and physically resisted arrest. Every one of those claims fell apart against the footage, the receipt, and the witnesses. One line of Derek's report failing after another, the moment it met an angle he hadn't controlled. Cross's report didn't call it a misunderstanding. It called it what it was, a false account, contradicted point by independent evidence. That contradiction opened the door to something larger. Cross ordered a full audit of every database query Derek had run over the past 2 years. What came back went far beyond one bad morning at a diner. The logs showed a pattern that had nothing to do with actual police work. Searches clustered at odd hours, late at night, early on days off, always disconnected from any case number a supervisor might have questioned. Derek had repeatedly searched police systems for information tied to no legitimate law enforcement purpose. Addresses, driver records, vehicle registrations, criminal histories, personal contact details. Many of the names matched people discussed in Derek's private online Stolen Valor group. Some searches had been run while he was off duty entirely. Several were followed, within days, by posts in that same group containing details that had never been public. A street name, a make and model, a workplace nobody outside that person's circle should have known. One name in the audit belonged to Eric Donovan, a former Army medic who'd left the service years earlier and now worked a quiet job at a hardware distributor 2 counties over. Months earlier, a photograph from a charity event had shown Eric wearing medals, and members of Derek's online group had accused him of wearing honors he hadn't earned, picking apart the photo pixel by pixel in a thread that ran for days. Derek had used police access to pull Eric's home address and vehicle information, without ever opening an actual investigation, without a complaint, without a case number, without anything beyond his own certainty that he'd spotted another fraud. Not long after, Eric began receiving anonymous messages that referenced details about his home and his routine that had never been posted anywhere public. The color of his truck, the street he turned down each morning, the hours he usually left for work. Investigators couldn't prove Derek had written every one of those messages himself. What they could prove, cleanly and completely, was that he had used law enforcement systems for a private purpose against a man who had no command duty office to call, no Navy liaison to verify him, no priority line that could reach a police chief's desk within minutes. Eric had spent months looking over his shoulder in his own driveway, never once learning why. Eric's case became the clearest measure of what Derek's behavior actually was. Once you looked at someone the system hadn't happened to protect, Cross's team preserved Derek's private messages and posts from the group. The content was consistent and damning. Comments built on racial stereotypes about what a real veteran should look like. Boasts about using police resources to check people out. Discussions about confronting strangers in public. Photographs of license plates shared without context. A wave of celebration posted about Marcus's arrest hours before any verification had come back. And later, once word started to spread, an attempt to frame the whole thing as a cover-up protecting Marcus rather than a mistake exposing Derek. One thread, posted the night before the arrest, showed Derek describing a gut feeling about a man he'd seen twice at the diner, weeks apart, always in plain clothes, never once causing trouble. Other members had encouraged him to get eyes on it. Language investigators later read as exactly what it looked like, a plan forming before any legitimate suspicion existed at all. The pattern established motive. It established bias. It established that this hadn't been one impulsive morning, but a habit that had simply run out of room to hide. The investigation also turned up warning signs that had gone nowhere long before that day. One supervisor had once dismissed Derek's online activity as a harmless hobby, something to laugh about during a shift change conversation rather than something to log. Another had never questioned why his database search volume ran far higher than any comparable officer's, because nothing in the department's systems was built to flag activity disconnected from an actual case file. The queries simply vanished into a general log nobody was assigned to read. Chief Caldwell accepted that failure as his own when he spoke with the state investigators, without trying to soften it. The department, in the weeks that followed, moved through consequences that fit each level of the failure. A supervisor stripped of oversight duties, another placed on suspension, and a new external monitoring requirement placed over exactly the kind of database access Derek had abused for years. None of it painted every officer in that building as corrupt. Most of them had done their jobs the way Bell had, asking the right questions, refusing to sign off on what didn't hold up, doing the unglamorous work of double-checking a fellow officer's story instead of simply trusting a badge to mean honesty. The case moved to federal review once the state investigation documented what looked like more than a local policy violation. A USA Maya Bennett examined the evidence with a prosecutor's caution, laying out what the facts could actually support. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law, knowingly false statements in an official report, unauthorized access to protected computer systems, and misuse of law enforcement information for private purposes. She spent the better part of a week working through the file with Cross before she ever filed anything, checking each database log against the time-stamped posts, making sure every claim she'd eventually stand behind in court could be traced back to something a jury could see for themselves, rather than something she was simply asking them to believe. She was careful about what the case wasn't. Derek hadn't compromised any classified material. Waking a locked government phone screen wasn't an act of espionage, and nothing in the file came close to supporting that kind of charge. What mattered legally was simpler and, in its own way, more serious. A federal device seized during an arrest that never had a lawful foundation, handled by an officer who'd tried to access it without any justification at all. Derek was terminated from the department for unlawful detention, racially biased policing, dishonesty in an official report, misuse of police authority, unauthorized database searches, and failure to follow evidence procedures. The state certification board moved next, suspending his credentials and ultimately accepting the permanent surrender of his certification once the pattern was fully documented. Agencies that had once considered him for security-sensitive assignments were formally notified, a routine step that nonetheless closed doors he'd spent years assuming would always stay open to a man who carried a badge. His career didn't end because of one furious phone call from a Navy office. It ended through paperwork, audits, sworn statements, and video that simply refused to match what he'd written down. Months later, Derek stood in federal court, a suit hanging looser on him than it had at his own sentencing hearing for the department, the tactical bearing he'd built for himself over the years nowhere in evidence now. Marcus wasn't there. He'd been asked, more than once, to attend and had declined every time, the same way he'd declined the reporters who kept calling. The prosecutor made the point plainly, without theater. This case was never about a police officer insulting a Navy SEAL. It was about an officer who had turned a private obsession into an official act, detaining a man without a reported crime, writing an account the evidence directly contradicted, and using systems built for public safety as a tool against private citizens who'd never agreed to be watched. She reminded the court, briefly, that Eric Donovan had lived for months not knowing why strangers seemed to know things about his life they had no business knowing, and that Derek's badge was the reason they had. Derek accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial on the full weight of what the evidence showed. He received a federal prison sentence, a term of supervised release afterward, permanent loss of his police certification, and formal restrictions on any future access to law enforcement or government databases. Consequences tied directly to what he'd actually done. Nothing added for effect. Nothing inflated to satisfy an audience that had never sat in that courtroom. Marcus went back to duty within the week. He turned down the interview requests, one after another. A local news producer, a national morning show, a podcast host who kept calling from a number Marcus never saved, and released a single short statement instead, that no citizen should need rank, military status, or a federal contact list just to receive a fair and lawful investigation. At home, before his next set of orders, he unclasped Aaron Cole's memorial bracelet and set it down beside a folded memorial program and a photograph from years earlier. 3 men in desert fatigues squinting against the sun, arms slung over each other's shoulders in a way that only made sense once you knew one of them wasn't coming home. He thought about what the small insignia on his fleece had actually meant: service, loss, a widow's decision to hand him something of her husband's to carry into a diner on an ordinary morning. Derek had looked at that same small piece of cloth and seen an opportunity to prove something about himself instead. What stayed with Marcus longest wasn't the arrest, and it wasn't the cuffs biting into his wrists in front of a room full of strangers. It was Eric Donovan's file, sitting there in the evidence room next to his own, a reminder of exactly what happens to a person when no verified command line exists to make the call that had saved him. Weeks after the sentencing, Marcus stood beside a quiet memorial wall bearing Aaron Cole's name, dressed in plain civilian clothes, no uniform, no cameras. The wall sat at the edge of a small park near the base, granite still cool from the morning, a handful of names etched into it that most passers-by would never stop to read. Captain Price found him there. "The database reforms are moving forward," Price said. "Monthly audits, supervisor approval for anything outside an active case, alerts for searches that don't connect to one. They're also notifying everyone whose information Holland pulled without cause." "Eric Donovan," Marcus said. "Has anyone reached him yet?" "They're contacting him this week." "Good," Marcus said, and meant it more than the single word suggested. He nodded and let it sit there, saying nothing further about Derek. He rested one hand briefly against the bracelet on his wrist, then let it fall. The metal warm now from his own skin, instead of cold the way it had been that first morning. The call from the Pentagon that day hadn't been the thing that ended Derek Holland's career. It had simply made sure that one officer's unsupported version of events didn't get to stand as the only account of what happened inside a small-town diner. What actually ended his career was everything that came after: a stereotype mistaken for evidence, a private quiz mistaken for an investigation, lawful silence mistaken for obstruction, calm compliance mistaken for resistance, a written report the video refused to support, restricted databases turned into a private tool, and warning signs that had gone unread for years until someone finally checked. Marcus hadn't won because he carried more weight than Derek expected, or because a command office answered a phone faster than a local station could argue. He'd come through it because the evidence survived intact, from the first cup of coffee to the last signed form. The quiet man Derek had called a fraud had earned everything he wore that morning. The officer accusing him had never earned the trust his own badge was supposed to represent. Riverside's reforms kept moving long after the courtroom emptied out. The monthly audits, the supervisor sign-offs, the alerts that now fired the moment a query drifted away from any open case. None of it undid what Eric Donovan had lived through, or the morning Marcus lost to a holding room and a locked phone. What it did was smaller and steadier and closer to what either of them had actually asked for. A record that couldn't be quietly rewritten. A system built to notice, the next time, before somebody else had to make a call, like the one Marcus had made from memory that morning, hoping someone on the other end would still pick up.